Yeah. I'm back, man. Part 5 in this bitch. So yeah, I know in the beginning when I first started my videos too, I started saying I was gonna call all these sessions, and so these are actually sessions. I'm gonna have to go back and start doing my shit and calling them sessions again instead of parts, part 1 and 2 and all that. I really don't like that because these are basically sessions, man. They sessions between us, jogging our memories and jogging our minds rather, and trying to figure shit out and just exploring the possibilities and the theories out there and things that could be. And so anyway, like I was saying, so coming on to part 4 and 5, this is basically the structure of the personality and the three aspects of it. And so and like I ended off in part 4, I was saying the three aspects of a personality is ID, ego, and superego. And so now I'm going to explain to you uh, the definitions, the functions, and what each one of these things do. The three aspects. And so first, the first aspect of the personality is the ID, or the id. They call it the id or the ID. I say ID, but so I got caught shit. I almost did my leg like my daddy used to do and shit, with the old man styles. You know. Okay, so check it though, man. So the ID or id. This is the only component of our personality that is present from birth. So this is the only component of our personality that is present with us from birth. The ID is driven by the pleasure principle, which strives for immediate gratification of all desires, wants, and needs. If these needs are not satisfied immediately, the result is a state of anxiety or tension. The ID is the biological force, and it is predominantly part of the unconscious mind. The ID is the instinctual biological component. I want. The ID is made up of all the primal urges and desires. The ID is entirely unconscious, selfish, chaotic, instinctive, impulsive, irrational, primitive, and tries to satisfy our basic sexual and aggressive drives. It also demands immediate satisfaction, regardless of the consequences. The ID consists of all the inherited or biological components of personality. Although people eventually learn to control it via ego, the ID remains infantile in its functions throughout a person's life. Okay, so it says the ID consists of all the inherited or biological components of personality. Although people eventually learn to control it via ego, the ID remains infantile in its functions throughout a person's life and does not change with time and experience as it is not in touch with the external world. The ID is not affected by reality, logic, or the everyday world as it operates within the unconscious part of the mind. This is an area in which we can't readily access. However, it is flooded with emotions and motivations that do impact our actions. So it said again, the ID is not affected by reality, logic, or the everyday world as it operates, or the everyday world. So the ID is not affected by reality, logic, or the everyday world as it operates within the unconscious part of the mind. This is an area in which we can't readily access. However, it is flooded with emotions and motivations that impact our actions. The ID equals pleasure. It's a pleasure seeker, instinctive, hostile, childish, represses memories, and is rebellious. And so that's the first function of personality, or one of the aspects of personality. Now, the second aspect of personality is called the ego. And I'm sure everybody know what ego is, but everybody's not really understanding, and I didn't either at first, how far and how much the ego dictates everything we do on a daily basis in most decisions. Okay, and so the ego is the component of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. So let me read that again. The ego is the component of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. The ego has an optimal state that maintains balance between high and low. A high optimum person will behave proudly, while a lower optimal person will have low self-esteem. The ego begins to develop during the first 3 years of a child's life. And it is a part of the consciousness. And it is a part of consciousness. The ego operates based on the reality principle, which strives to satisfy the ID's desire in realistic and socially appropriate ways. The ego moderates between the ID and the superego. In many cases, the ID's impulses can be satisfied through a process of delayed gratification. The ego will eventually allow the behavior, but only in the appropriate time and place. The ego is the part of the mind that has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. The ego is partly conscious. The ego is rational in decision making. Okay, so the ego is partly conscious. So the ego is the partly conscious, rational decision making component of personality that regulates thoughts and behavior. Okay, so the ego is the partly conscious, rational, decision making component of personality that regulates thoughts and behavior. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the ID is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego considers social realities and norms, etiquette and rules in deciding how to behave. It works out realistic ways and satisfying the id's demands in a manner acceptable in the real world. Ego is extremely rational. The ego is sensitive. The ego is overly efficient. The superego. Okay. The superego. The superego is the last component of personality to develop around age 5. So the superego is the last component of our personality to develop, and it develops around age 5. The superego is the aspect of personality that holds all of our internalized moral standards and ideas that we acquire from both parents and society. Our sense of right and wrong. The superego provides guidelines for making judgments. The superego is the partly conscious evaluative and moralistic component of our personality that is formed through the internalization. Hold on, let me get this again. The superego is the partly conscious evaluative and moralistic component of our personality that is formed through the internalization of parental and societal rules. The superego focuses on how we ought to behave. The superego acts to perfect and civilize our behavior, working to suppress all unacceptable urges of the ID. Okay, so the superego is the partly conscious self-evaluative moralistic component of our personality that is formed through the internalization of parental and societal rules. The superego focuses on how we ought to behave. The superego acts to perfect and civilize our behavior, working to suppress all unacceptable urges of the ID. The superego struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. Okay, so the superego struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. The superego consists of two systems: the conscious and the ideal self. The conscious can punish the ego through causing feelings of guilt. The ideal self or ego idea is an imaginary picture of how you or we ought to be. And represents career, aspirations, and how to treat other people and how to behave as a member of society. Okay, so the ideal self or ego idea is an imaginary picture of how you or we ought to be and represents career, aspirations, and how to treat other people and how to behave as a member of society. The superego is social, and the superego is based on how we ought to be, perfect and civilized, ideas, standards for judgment, morality. The morality principle is the last component to emerge conscious, unconscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind. Okay, so that's the superego. So let's go to this here. So I'm gonna come back. I'm already at 16 minutes, so I'm gonna come back on part 6. Part 6 will be the last on wrapping this first part or first portion of image based off the psychological aspects of it, mental aspects of it, image, where it all derives and comes from. So, once we get past this, then we get to talking about the most important part is how we project this image out into the world. So it's your boy Bang, man, back with another motherfucking Boo Bang Theory. It's part 5 at image, our addiction to it. The 3 aspects of personality. I'll be back with part 6, man. Finish this up so we can start getting to some real talk. Some real, real good shit, man. Sit down and discuss shit like a family would. You hear me? Really be truthful and honest with it, with ourselves. So I'll be back action, man. Yeah.